Have you ever considered where your deepest beliefs truly come from? Is it from the books you've read, the articles you've consumed, or the endless stream of information at your fingertips? What if our modern obsession with the written word has not only shaped our understanding of the world, but also blinded us to a more profound and ancient form of wisdom? The man known as one of history's greatest thinkers, Socrates, refused to write down his ideas, and today we're going to uncover why. This isn't simply an eccentric quirk of an ancient philosopher. It's a challenge to the very foundations of how we acquire and value knowledge. Socrates lived in a pivotal period, a time when oral tradition was gradually giving way to the written word in ancient Greece. But he remained steadfast in his commitment to dialogue and questioning, believing that true understanding could only be achieved through active conversation. Our over-reliance on written information has led to passive learning, a decline in critical thinking, and the dangerous illusion that simply possessing information equates to genuine knowledge. Consider how easily misinformation spreads online, how often we accept information at face value without questioning its source or validity, and how social media echo chambers reinforce our existing beliefs, stifling intellectual curiosity and critical engagement. By the end of this exploration, you'll gain a deeper understanding of the strengths and weaknesses inherent in both oral and written communication. We will explore how to cultivate critical thinking skills through dialogue and questioning, inspired by Socrates' method, and challenge the uncritical acceptance of written knowledge that dominates our modern world. We'll uncover the limitations of writing, the vital importance of dialogue in fostering genuine understanding, the subtle dangers of passive learning, and the seductive illusion of knowledge that the written word can create. Stay with me, because understanding Socrates' reasoning can lead you to a more active, engaged, and critical approach to how you consume and process information, ultimately empowering you to think for yourself. Now, you might be thinking that Socrates' choice seems counterintuitive or even a little absurd. After all, isn't writing essential for progress, for preserving knowledge across generations? It's understandable to feel that way, and this isn't about rejecting writing altogether, but rather developing a more nuanced and critical awareness of both its immense power and its inherent limitations. So let's delve deeper into the world of Socrates and explore the hidden truth behind his refusal to write. Now, let's delve deeper into why Socrates held the spoken word in such high regard, viewing it as vastly superior to the written text when it came to achieving genuine understanding. He saw the spoken word as a living, breathing entity, capable of adapting and responding to the specific needs of the listener. Writing, on the other hand, he considered static and lifeless, incapable of engaging in the dynamic interplay that true learning requires. What did Socrates mean by all this? What he meant was that Socratic dialogue, at its heart, fosters critical thinking, active engagement, and a collaborative pursuit of truth. It wasn't about passively receiving information, but about actively participating in the construction of knowledge. Think about it. Socratic dialogue involves a continuous process of questioning, challenging assumptions, and relentlessly seeking clear definitions. It's a method that forces individuals to examine their own beliefs, identify inconsistencies, and arrive at a deeper understanding through rigorous self-reflection and intellectual exchange. To put it simply, it's a dynamic dance of minds, a collaborative journey towards enlightenment. Consider the preliterate societies of ancient Greece, where oral tradition reigned supreme. In these cultures, knowledge wasn't stored in books, but in the minds and memories of the people. Stories, myths, and historical accounts were passed down through generations by word of mouth, creating a strong sense of community and shared identity. Bards and storytellers held a place of honor, entrusted with the vital task of preserving cultural memory. What this fostered was a communal responsibility for knowledge, where everyone participated in the ongoing process of remembering, retelling, and reinterpreting the stories that shaped their world. This is a stark contrast to our modern world, where knowledge is often seen as a commodity to be consumed passively. The immediacy and interactivity of spoken dialogue allowed for clarification, adaptation, and personalized learning in ways that writing simply could not replicate. If a listener didn't understand something, they could immediately ask for clarification. The speaker could then adapt their explanation to the specific needs and understanding of the individual. What this created was a dynamic feedback loop, ensuring that knowledge was not only transmitted but also truly understood. In other words, this fostered a community of learners, where everyone was both a student and a teacher, constantly learning from and challenging one another. Doesn't that seem like the best way to spread knowledge? But here's the twist. Socrates harbored deep concerns about writing's potential to lead to misinterpretations and a superficial understanding of knowledge. What happens, he wondered, when words are detached from their context, from the living presence of the speaker, and from the dynamic interplay of dialogue? This leads us to a critical question. Does writing inevitably distort and diminish the true meaning of ideas? Now, let's explore the problem of detachment and fixed meaning that so troubled Socrates. His worry stemmed from the idea that writing can create a false sense of knowledge. Readers passively accept information without critically engaging with it, as if the written word holds some inherent authority. Writing, in his view, is detached from its author and their original intent, making it vulnerable to misinterpretation and misuse. What he was suggesting is that the act of writing freezes thought, turning it into a fixed and immutable object, divorced from the living, breathing context of its creation. What this means is that Socrates was deeply concerned about the concept of decontextualization. Written words, he feared, could be easily misinterpreted when divorced from their original setting and intention. What happens when we strip away the nuances of tone, gesture, and facial expression that accompany spoken language? What happens when we ignore the historical, cultural, and personal context in which a text was created? Writing, he cautioned, can easily become dogma, a set of fixed beliefs that are blindly accepted without critical examination. Think about it. How often do we encounter statements online that are taken completely out of context, twisted to fit a particular agenda, or used to justify harmful actions? Consider the historical examples of religious or political texts that have been misused or misinterpreted due to a lack of contextual understanding. Specific phrases have been cherry-picked, taken out of context, and used to justify acts of violence, oppression, and discrimination. The key takeaway from this is that understanding any text requires careful attention to its historical, cultural, and linguistic context. We must ask ourselves, who wrote this? When did they write it? What was their purpose in writing it? What were the social and political conditions that shaped their thinking? What are the potential biases or limitations of their perspective? Only by grappling with these questions can we hope to arrive at a reasonably accurate interpretation. What's essential, then, is critical thinking skills for navigating the complexities of written texts and avoiding the pitfalls of misinterpretation. Source evaluation, bias detection, logical reasoning, and the ability to identify faulty arguments are some of the skills needed. Think of it like this: we need to be detectives of the written word, constantly questioning, investigating, and analyzing the information we encounter. And this is not always easy, but that's not all. Socrates also believed that writing weakens memory and discourages the active pursuit of knowledge. So, how does reliance on external sources affect the internal landscape of our minds? Let's now consider Socrates' argument that reliance on writing diminishes the need for memorization and the development of active intellectual engagement. He worried that the human mind would atrophy if it became too reliant on external memory aids. The human mind, he believed, is like a muscle. The more we exercise it, the stronger it becomes. The less we use it, the weaker it gets. If we constantly outsource our memory to external devices, what happens to our ability to remember things on our own? In oral cultures, memorization was a crucial skill, fostering mental agility, creativity, and a deep understanding of knowledge. Bards and storytellers spent years, even decades, memorizing vast amounts of information, from epic poems to genealogies to legal codes. This wasn't simply rote memorization. It was an active process of internalizing knowledge, making it a part of oneself. Active recall was a form of intellectual exercise, strengthening the mind's ability to focus, concentrate, and make connections between different ideas. What this suggests is that the very act of remembering shapes our minds and expands our capacity for thought. Research has consistently demonstrated the cognitive benefits of memorization. Studies have shown that memorization can improve attention, concentration, and working memory, all of which are essential for critical thinking and problem solving. Conversely, over-reliance on external memory aids, such as digital devices and note-taking, has been linked to a decline in these cognitive abilities. Consider a study published in the journal Applied Cognitive Psychology, which found that students who took notes on laptops performed worse on conceptual questions than students who took notes by hand. The researchers concluded that handwriting forces students to process information more deeply, leading to better understanding and retention. It's a matter of active engagement versus passive recording. Therefore, active engagement with information, through memorization and internal reflection, leads to a more profound and lasting understanding than passive reading. Now, contrast this with the effects of skimming and superficial information consumption in the digital age. How often do we scroll through endless feeds of information, absorbing bits and pieces without truly engaging with them? How often do we mistake information for knowledge, confusing the mere possession of facts with genuine understanding? Socrates might argue that we are becoming a society of intellectual dilettantes, superficially acquainted with a vast array of information but deeply knowledgeable about very little. Are we sacrificing depth for breadth? But here's a question. Was Socrates entirely correct? Can we acknowledge the undeniable benefits of writing and its crucial role in advancing human knowledge, without dismissing his concerns about its potential downsides? Let's acknowledge the undeniable advantages of writing for preserving knowledge, disseminating information, and fostering intellectual progress. Writing enables cumulative progress across generations, allowing us to build upon the insights and discoveries of those who came before us. Think about it. Without writing, much of our history, science, and philosophy would be lost to the mists of time. Writing is a form of immortality, preserving our thoughts and ideas for future generations. Furthermore, writing allows for complex analysis, systematic organization of thoughts, and the creation of lasting works of art and scholarship. Writing refines thinking by forcing us to articulate our ideas clearly and precisely. The act of writing forces us to slow down, to consider our words carefully, and to organize our thoughts in a logical and coherent manner. This process of refinement can lead to deeper insights and a more nuanced understanding of the subject at hand. Consider the intricate arguments of philosophical treatises, the complex narratives of novels, and the meticulous observations of scientific reports. These are all achievements that would be impossible without the power of writing. Writing has spurred scientific advancements, facilitated democratic discourse, and enriched human culture through literature and art. Consider the scientific revolution, which was fueled by the widespread dissemination of written knowledge. The printing press allowed scientists to share their discoveries with a global audience, accelerating the pace of scientific progress. Think about the role of writing in promoting democratic discourse, allowing citizens to express their opinions, debate public policy, and hold their leaders accountable. Then, consider the countless works of literature and art that have enriched our lives, challenged our assumptions, and expanded our understanding of the human condition. Writing in all its forms has been a powerful force for progress, enlightenment, and cultural enrichment. Therefore, a balanced approach, integrating the strengths of both oral and written communication, is essential for cultivating wisdom and critical thinking. Encourage viewers to engage in dialogue and debate, to question assumptions, and to actively participate in the construction of knowledge. What this means is that we must strive to be both active readers and engaged conversationalists, constantly challenging ourselves and others to think more deeply, more critically, and more creatively. What will we discover if we combine these methods? But we're just scratching the surface. As we continue, we'll uncover the final insights into Socrates' enduring relevance and see how his wisdom transcends time. But that's not all, because now we need to consider the illusion of authorship and ownership that comes along with writing. Does writing foster a false sense of intellectual property, hindering the free exchange of ideas and collaborative knowledge building? This illusion, while seemingly harmless, can have far-reaching consequences on our pursuit of wisdom. What this means is that writing can create a sense of individual ownership over ideas, leading to intellectual silos and a reluctance to share or build upon each other's work. What happens when knowledge becomes a commodity, something to be hoarded and protected, rather than a shared resource for the benefit of all? This sense of ownership can stifle creativity and innovation, as individuals become more concerned with protecting their intellectual property than with pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Think about it. Is the illusion of authorship, recognition, and control worth the limitations it places on collaborative knowledge building? Consider the historical examples where disputes over authorship have stifled creativity or led to unnecessary conflict. Take Galileo's battles with the Church over heliocentrism. While Galileo meticulously documented his observations and arguments in writing, his insistence on claiming sole authorship of these ideas, even though they built upon centuries of astronomical observations, contributed to the conflict with the Church. This ultimately led to his persecution and the suppression of scientific progress for decades. And consider contemporary examples in patent law and academic publishing. The constant legal battles over intellectual property rights can often hinder innovation and prevent the widespread dissemination of knowledge. Patent trolls, for instance, often exploit loopholes in the patent system to extract licensing fees from innovators, stifling creativity and progress. Socrates, on the other hand, viewed wisdom as a shared pursuit, a collaborative journey towards enlightenment. He believed that knowledge should be freely exchanged and debated, not hoarded or protected. The very act of questioning one's own assumptions and recognizing the limitations of individual perspectives fosters a culture of intellectual humility and openness. What he understood was that true wisdom arises not from individual genius, but from the collective intelligence of a community engaged in constant dialogue and critical inquiry. Isn't that something we should value? This raises a critical question. Is the illusion of authorship, recognition, and control worth the limitations it places on collaborative knowledge building? What is lost when knowledge becomes a possession? If Socrates is right, then the relentless pursuit of individual credit may be undermining our collective capacity for wisdom and understanding. Now, let's examine the death of dialogue and the rise of monologue that can result from an over-reliance on writing. Does an over-reliance on writing lead to a decline in meaningful dialogue and critical debate, resulting in intellectual stagnation and the formation of echo chambers? This shift from spoken word to the written word has profound implications for how we learn, think, and interact with one another. What happens when we prioritize writing over dialogue? Writing, by its very nature, encourages monologue, a one-way communication from author to reader. The reader passively absorbs the information, without the opportunity to question, challenge, or engage in a reciprocal exchange. This contrasts sharply with the active engagement required in conversation, where ideas are constantly being tested, refined, and co-created. This encourages a passive approach to knowledge consumption. Compare the dynamics of a Socratic dialogue with those of a lecture or a written essay. The lecture is a primarily one-way street where the lecturer hands down information and truth, whereas, as previously mentioned, Socratic dialogue is adaptive and ever-changing. Think about it, the dynamics of a Socratic dialogue are characterized by questioning, challenging assumptions, and collaborative discovery. Socrates didn't lecture his students. He engaged them in a dynamic process of inquiry, constantly pushing them to examine their own beliefs and arrive at their own conclusions. This is in stark contrast to a lecture or a written essay, which tend to be more didactic and less interactive. The lecturer presents information, and the student passively absorbs it, without necessarily engaging in critical reflection. In an essay, the author presents their argument, and the reader is left to accept or reject it, without the opportunity for direct dialogue or debate. The importance of active listening, respectful questioning, and engaging in critical debate for intellectual growth and societal progress cannot be overstated. How can we incorporate dialogic principles into our online and offline interactions, fostering a culture of intellectual humility and open-mindedness? What we need to understand is that genuine dialogue requires a willingness to listen to opposing viewpoints, to challenge our own assumptions, and to engage in respectful debate, even when it's uncomfortable. But how can we foster these skills in an age dominated by social media echo chambers and polarized political discourse? What happens to a society when its citizens stop engaging in genuine dialogue and critical debate? What are the consequences of retreating into echo chambers where one's own views are constantly reinforced? If Socrates is right, then the decline of dialogue poses a grave threat to our intellectual and societal well-being. We need to find ways to cultivate active listening, respectful questioning, and critical debate in all aspects of our lives, from our personal relationships to our political discourse. We need to actively seek out opposing viewpoints, challenge our own assumptions, and be willing to engage in open-minded dialogue, even when it's difficult. But there's something else that Socrates worried about. Let's turn to the seduction of authority and the decline of critical thinking that can come from an over-reliance on the written word. Does writing lend an undue air of authority to ideas, discouraging critical thinking and independent judgment? The written word, often perceived as more credible or authoritative than the spoken word, can have a subtle yet powerful influence on our thinking. What this means is that the written word is often seen as more trustworthy than the spoken word, regardless of its actual merit. This bias stems from a number of psychological factors, including confirmation bias and authority bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs, while ignoring information that contradicts them. Authority bias is the tendency to accept information from authority figures, even when that information is questionable or inaccurate. What happens when these biases combine with the perceived authority of the written word? Consider historical and contemporary examples of how written texts have been used to manipulate public opinion, justify harmful actions, or promote misinformation. The history of propaganda is replete with examples of written texts being used to deceive and manipulate populations. From the protocols of the elders of Zion to the fabricated documents used to justify the Iraq War, written texts have been used to promote harmful ideologies, incite violence, and justify oppression. The prevalence of fake news and misinformation on social media highlights the ongoing threat of written texts being used to manipulate public opinion. This raises a crucial question. How can we cultivate a healthy skepticism towards written information without falling into cynicism or rejecting knowledge altogether? What are the essential skills for discerning truth from falsehood in the age of information overload? We need to teach people how to evaluate sources, identify biases, and think critically about the information they encounter. We need to encourage them to question authority, challenge assumptions, and seek out diverse perspectives. Here are some concrete strategies for recognizing fake news and misinformation. Check the source's reputation. Look for evidence of bias. Verify the information with multiple sources, and be wary of emotionally charged headlines or content. How can we cultivate a healthy skepticism towards written information without falling into cynicism or rejecting knowledge altogether? What are the essential skills for discerning truth from falsehood in the age of information overload? If Socrates is right, then the uncritical acceptance of written authority poses a grave threat to our intellectual and political freedom. But here's the twist. Socrates also mistrusted writing because it cannot fully capture the nuances of lived experience, personal understanding, and the ever-changing nature of reality. Can writing ever truly capture the richness and complexity of human experience? What this means is that Socrates believed that true wisdom comes not just from intellectual knowledge, but from internal reflection, personal experience, and the ongoing process of self-discovery. Knowledge is one thing, but wisdom is something else entirely. Knowledge is the accumulation of facts and information, while wisdom is the ability to apply that knowledge to practical situations and make sound judgments. True wisdom is not something that can be acquired passively, by reading books or listening to lectures. It requires active engagement with the world, internal reflection, and the willingness to learn from one's own experiences. Consider Socrates' own life as an example of someone who prioritized lived experience, meaningful relationships, and ethical action over the pursuit of abstract knowledge or the accumulation of written texts. His trial and death, for instance, were not merely intellectual exercises. They were profound moments of personal and ethical reckoning. He chose to uphold his principles, even in the face of death, demonstrating the importance of integrity and moral courage. What we see in this situation is that Socrates prioritized lived experience and ethical action above all else, valuing wisdom over knowledge. How can we prioritize personal experience, self-reflection, and meaningful relationships in our own lives, alongside the acquisition of knowledge and the consumption of information? What practical steps can we take to integrate these principles into our daily lives? We can start by cultivating mindfulness, taking time each day to reflect on our experiences and learn from our mistakes. We can prioritize meaningful relationships, nurturing our connections with family, friends, and community. We can engage in ethical action, striving to live in accordance with our values and make a positive impact on the world. As we continue, we will delve into how to integrate these principles into daily life. But for now, consider the core theme. True understanding and wisdom are found not just in the written word, but in active engagement with the world and continuous self-reflection. What practical steps can we take to integrate these principles into our daily lives? But we are far from finished. Now let's question if Socrates' bias was justified, and if so, what that means for the overall state of knowledge. But let's take this a step further. What if Socrates' bias, as it might seem to some, was not a bias at all, but a profound insight into the very nature of knowledge and understanding? Now, let's delve into the paradox of the blank slate and the active mind. What this means is that Socrates, a fountain of wisdom, paradoxically left no writings. He embraced what might be seen as a blank slate approach, believing that the mind should not be a passive recipient of information but an active explorer, constantly questioning, analyzing, and synthesizing knowledge. How did this blank slate approach foster a more active and engaged mind than reliance on external texts? By not writing, Socrates forced himself and others to actively remember, question, and develop ideas, rather than passively relying on a written record. This wasn't about rejecting knowledge. It was about how knowledge is best acquired and used. Socrates valued lived experience over written knowledge, seeing true understanding as something that is actively constructed through dialogue and reflection. Socrates believed that the mind should not be a passive recipient of information, but an active explorer, constantly questioning, analyzing, and synthesizing knowledge. This aligns remarkably well with modern understandings of neuroplasticity and active learning. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life, is enhanced by active engagement and challenge. When we passively consume information, our brains are less stimulated, and learning is less effective. Think about it, the more we actively question, analyze, and synthesize information, the more we strengthen neural connections and deepen our understanding. The implications of this are enormous. Contrast Socrates' approach with the modern emphasis on accumulating information and consuming content passively. Today, we are bombarded with information from countless sources, leading to what some call information overload. Statistics show that the average person spends over 7 hours a day on screens, much of it passively consuming content. Reading habits, too, often involve skimming articles or passively scrolling through social media feeds, rather than engaging in deep, critical reading. Consider the difference between reading a book for pleasure and engaging in a Socratic dialogue. One is a passive consumption of information, while the other is an active exploration of ideas. Given this information overload, how does this blank slate approach align with current information overload issues? The core tenet of Socrates' philosophy was to teach people how to think. Consider the example of a student who excels at rote memorization but struggles to apply knowledge critically, versus a student who actively questions and explores ideas but may have gaps in their factual knowledge. The first student can recite facts and figures but lacks the ability to analyze, evaluate, and synthesize information. The second student, while perhaps lacking in specific details, possesses the critical thinking skills necessary to adapt to new situations and solve complex problems. Which student embodies the Socratic ideal? The student who actively questions and explores ideas embodies the Socratic ideal, prioritizing understanding over mere information retention. But how do these students differ in their ability to cope with the challenges of the modern world? The student excelling at rote memorization might initially perform well on standardized tests, but they may struggle in situations requiring creativity, problem-solving, and adaptability. The Socratic student, though perhaps initially disadvantaged in a purely academic setting, would likely thrive in environments that value critical thinking, innovation, and lifelong learning. This brings us to how Socrates' methods challenged conventional education of his time. Was Socrates rejecting the content of education, or the methods? Perhaps Socrates was less concerned with the specific content being taught, and more concerned with the methods used to impart knowledge. He challenged the prevailing educational methods that emphasized rote memorization and passive acceptance of authority. His focus was on cultivating critical thinking skills, encouraging students to question assumptions, and developing their own independent judgment. But Socrates was not alone in his time. Now let's look at how Socrates was always challenging the sophists. The sophists were contemporary intellectuals who emphasized rhetoric and persuasive speech over genuine wisdom and truth. They were skilled orators who could argue any side of an issue, often using clever but ultimately deceptive techniques to win arguments. How does this link to our earlier point that writing lends an undue air of authority to ideas? The sophists often relied on written texts and prepackaged arguments to impress their audiences, giving their words an air of authority that they might not otherwise possess. Think of it like this: a well-written speech, even if based on faulty logic or misinformation, can be incredibly persuasive, especially when delivered with confidence and charisma. The sophists relied on written texts and prepackaged arguments to impress their audiences, while Socrates emphasized spontaneous dialogue and critical inquiry. To illustrate, imagine a debate between Socrates and a sophist. The sophist might present a polished, well-rehearsed speech, citing authorities and quoting texts to support their position. Socrates, on the other hand, would engage in a dynamic process of questioning, challenging the sophist's assumptions and exposing the weaknesses in their arguments. The sophist might appear more impressive at first, but Socrates' method would ultimately lead to a deeper understanding of the issue at hand. So what happens when style triumphs over substance? The audience may be swayed by the sophist's eloquence, but they may not actually understand the underlying issues or be able to think critically about the arguments being presented. Socrates viewed the sophist's approach as superficial and ultimately harmful, as it prioritized style over substance and discouraged independent thinking. By focusing on rhetoric and persuasion rather than genuine understanding, the sophists, according to Socrates, were essentially training people to be followers rather than thinkers. They were teaching them how to win arguments, not how to seek truth. How did this method create followers versus thinkers? By providing prepackaged arguments and emphasizing rhetoric, the sophists discouraged independent thought and critical inquiry. Their students learned to parrot their teachers' views rather than developing their own. Socrates, on the other hand, aimed to cultivate independent thinkers who could question authority and arrive at their own conclusions. Socrates' refusal to write down his ideas was partly a reaction against the sophists' methods. By avoiding the written word, Socrates prevented his ideas from becoming fixed and dogmatic, forcing his students to engage actively with them and develop their own interpretations. But was this a purely philosophical argument, or were there political considerations? The political climate of ancient Athens was turbulent, and Socrates' ideas were often seen as subversive. By not writing, he may have also been protecting himself from persecution, as his ideas could not be easily used against him. And here comes the question: how can we distinguish between genuine wisdom and mere rhetoric in today's world, where persuasive communication is highly valued? In today's world, where persuasive communication is highly valued, distinguishing between genuine wisdom and mere rhetoric can be challenging. How can we be Socratic in our consumption of arguments? One approach is to adopt a critical mindset, always questioning assumptions, seeking evidence, and considering alternative perspectives. Another is to focus on substance over style, prioritizing genuine understanding over mere eloquence. We can also learn to identify common rhetorical techniques, such as appeals to emotion, ad hominem attacks, and straw man arguments, that are often used to manipulate and deceive. The answer, therefore, lies in becoming more discerning consumers of information, actively engaging with ideas, and developing our own independent judgment. But here's the problem. Even when we seek out wisdom, is it possible that we might be doing more harm than good? This leads us to the danger of dogma and the importance of fluidity. What happens when writing solidifies ideas into dogma, hindering intellectual growth and preventing adaptation to new information? What if the very act of writing, which seems like a way to preserve knowledge, actually stifles it? Socrates believed that knowledge should be a living, evolving process, not a fixed set of beliefs. He emphasized the importance of questioning even one's own deeply held convictions, recognizing that truth is often complex and multifaceted. This is in contrast to a dogmatic approach, which clings rigidly to established beliefs, rejecting any challenges or alternative perspectives. But why is dogma so dangerous? Because it stifles intellectual curiosity, prevents adaptation to new information, and can lead to intolerance and conflict. Think about it, are we ever truly free if we don't question what we know? History provides ample examples of how rigid adherence to written texts has led to conflict, intolerance, and the suppression of new ideas. The religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, for instance, were fueled by rigid interpretations of religious texts and a refusal to tolerate alternative viewpoints. Scientific dogmatism, too, has often hindered progress, as new discoveries have been rejected simply because they contradicted established theories. Consider the case of Galileo, who was persecuted for challenging the Church's geocentric view of the universe. What happens when we prioritize dogma over truth? We risk stagnation, conflict, and the suppression of innovation. Socrates' commitment to dialogue and questioning allowed him to adapt his thinking in response to new evidence and arguments, fostering intellectual fluidity and open-mindedness. He was always willing to revise his views in light of new information, demonstrating a humility and intellectual honesty that is rare. How can we encourage such intellectual fluidity today? We can cultivate a mindset of curiosity and open-mindedness, always seeking out new information and challenging our own assumptions. We can embrace intellectual humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that our views may be incomplete or inaccurate. We can also foster a culture of respectful dialogue, encouraging open debate and the exchange of ideas. This all leads us to wonder how Socrates' concerns about writing might be even more relevant in the digital age, where information is constantly changing and easily disseminated. Can the Socratic method thrive in an online environment? As we turn to that, consider if the rise of digital technology has brought with it its own set of issues. Now, let's examine the hyperconnectivity paradox. In an age of unprecedented access to information, are we closer to truth, or has hyperconnectivity actually distanced us from genuine understanding? How can it be that more information can actually lead to less understanding? The internet and social media have created echo chambers, where individuals are primarily exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs, reinforcing biases and hindering critical thinking. Algorithms curate our online experiences, showing us content that is similar to what we have already engaged with. While this can be convenient, it also creates a filter bubble, limiting our exposure to diverse perspectives and reinforcing our existing biases. For example, if you primarily follow political commentators on one side of the spectrum, you are likely to be shown content that confirms your views, while opposing viewpoints are filtered out. What happens when we only hear what we already believe? We become more entrenched in our views, less open to new information, and less able to engage in constructive dialogue. The constant bombardment of information can lead to cognitive overload and a superficial understanding of complex issues. We are constantly multitasking, switching between different sources of information, and struggling to focus on any one thing for very long. Research shows that multitasking impairs cognitive function, reducing our ability to pay attention, process information, and make sound judgments. Is shallow understanding worse than no understanding? While some knowledge is better than none, it can be argued that shallow understanding is worse because it creates the illusion of knowledge without the substance. We may think we understand an issue, but in reality, we only have a superficial grasp of it, making us more susceptible to misinformation and manipulation. How can we leverage the internet's strengths without succumbing to its weaknesses? We can actively seek out diverse perspectives, challenging our own assumptions and engaging in respectful debate. We can limit our exposure to social media, prioritizing deep reading, reflection, and meaningful conversations. We can also develop critical thinking skills, learning to evaluate sources, identify biases, and discern truth from falsehood. If Socrates is right, then cultivating a critical, engaged, and independent mind is more important now than ever before. This returns us to our fundamental theme, because Socrates' refusal to write was not a rejection of knowledge itself, but a profound statement about the importance of cultivating an active, critical, and engaged mind. Socrates' solution was not a turning away from the world, but a turning inward, fostering the power of critical thought. But if the modern world has created challenges for his approach, perhaps there is more to the story. What if, by understanding all the nuance of Socrates' intentions, we can find a path towards enlightenment ourselves? But here's a twist. What if the written word, despite its permanence, inherently falls short of capturing the full spectrum of human thought and communication? Isn't it possible that something vital is lost in translation when ideas are reduced to ink on paper or pixels on a screen? The crucial element that Socrates seemed to recognize is that writing inherently loses the nuance and subtlety present in face-to-face communication. Tone, body language, facial expressions, and the immediate context of a conversation, all of these contribute to a fuller, richer understanding. Imagine trying to convey sarcasm or irony in an email without the aid of emojis or explicit disclaimers. It's difficult, isn't it? This is because spoken dialogue has a much higher bandwidth than written text. Bandwidth in this context refers to the amount of information that can be conveyed in a given time. Spoken language, with its added layers of vocal inflection and visual cues, transmits far more information than the written word alone. To illustrate this, consider a heated debate, perhaps one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. If you were to simply read a transcript of that debate, you would get a sense of the arguments presented, but you would miss the fiery passion in their voices, the piercing glares, the subtle gestures that underscored their points. Without these elements, the written transcript becomes a pale imitation of the actual event. It's like trying to appreciate a symphony by reading the sheet music without ever hearing the orchestra play. Isn't the full impact of the debate contingent on the nonverbal information being communicated? The implications of this loss of nuance are far-reaching. It can lead to misunderstandings, polarization, and a decline in empathy. Think about the prevalence of online conflicts and flame wars. How much of this stems from the inability to accurately interpret the tone and intent behind written messages? How often do we misread a comment or a post, taking offense where none was intended, simply because we lack the contextual cues that would be present in a face-to-face conversation? Could it be that the disembodied nature of online communication fosters a sense of detachment, making it easier to dehumanize and attack others? But does this inherent limitation of writing make it unsuitable for conveying complex philosophical ideas? Is philosophy, with its reliance on subtle distinctions and nuanced arguments, particularly vulnerable to this loss of fidelity? This brings us to another critical aspect of Socrates' reluctance to write, the problem of abstraction and the distance from reality. Now, let's delve deeper into how writing encourages abstraction, distancing us from the concrete realities that ground true understanding. The written word creates a layer of separation between the lived experience it represents. Think about it, a description of a sunset, no matter how eloquent, can never fully capture the sensory experience of actually witnessing one. The colors, the smells, the feel of the breeze on your skin, all of these are lost in the abstraction of language. The written word, therefore, becomes a substitute for reality, a representation that can never fully replicate the original. This relates to the concept of embodied knowledge, which posits that our understanding of the world is rooted in our physical experiences and sensory perceptions. We learn by doing, by interacting with our environment, by engaging our senses. Writing, on the other hand, can lead to a disembodied form of knowledge that is disconnected from reality. It can create a purely intellectual understanding that lacks the depth and richness of lived experience. For example, consider learning to play a musical instrument. You could read countless books on music theory and technique, but until you actually pick up the instrument and start practicing, your knowledge will remain abstract and superficial. Similarly, you could study martial arts by reading books and watching videos, but until you engage in hands-on training, you will not truly understand the movements and principles involved. In each case, knowledge comes alive only when it is embodied, when it is integrated with our physical senses and experiences. How do these two experiences compare in terms of skill retention and overall mastery? The implications of this abstraction are significant. It can lead to a detachment from ethical considerations and a failure to appreciate the consequences of our actions. When we deal with abstract concepts, we are less likely to feel the emotional weight of our decisions. For instance, it is easier to make decisions that harm others when those others are reduced to abstract statistics or faceless entities. The act of writing and reading, while valuable in many respects, can inadvertently contribute to this detachment. So, can abstract thinking truly lead to unethical actions? This brings us back to Socrates, who believed that true wisdom comes from engaging with the world and learning from experience, not from passively consuming written texts. Did Socrates see engagement with the world as more important than internal self-reflection? How does this emphasis on lived experience relate to his decision not to write? As we now transition to our next point, think on if this means Socrates valued knowledge gained through action as more valid than knowledge gained through study. Now, let's explore Socrates' preference for dialogue, because it actively engages the soul and stimulates intellectual curiosity, whereas reading can be a passive activity that leaves the mind dormant. What happens when we treat the mind like a container to be filled, rather than a fire to be kindled? Socrates saw the human soul, or psyche, as something that needed to be actively cultivated and engaged. Dialogue, with its back-and-forth exchange of ideas, was the perfect tool for this. It forced individuals to think on their feet, to defend their positions, and to adapt to new arguments. Reading, on the other hand, could easily become a passive activity, where the mind simply absorbs information without truly processing or questioning it. Doesn't passive engagement hinder true growth? This connects to the concept of intrinsic motivation, which refers to the internal drive to learn and explore. Active engagement and questioning foster a deeper and more lasting understanding than passive reception of information. When we are intrinsically motivated, we are more likely to persist in the face of challenges, to seek out new knowledge, and to integrate that knowledge into our existing understanding. Compare this to deep work with shallow work. Deep work, characterized by focused concentration and engagement, fosters a deeper and more lasting understanding. Psychological studies have consistently shown that active learning techniques, such as group discussions, debates, and problem-solving activities, lead to better knowledge retention and improved critical thinking skills compared to passive learning methods like lectures and rote memorization. One study by researchers at Washington University in St. Louis, for example, found that students who actively participated in class discussions scored significantly higher on exams than those who primarily listened to lectures. The researchers concluded that active engagement stimulates cognitive processes, leading to deeper learning and better retention. So how do these techniques really stack up when we look at the numbers? The implication is that an over-reliance on reading can stifle intellectual curiosity, creativity, and the development of independent thought. If we become too accustomed to passively receiving information, we may lose the ability to think for ourselves, to question authority, and to generate new ideas. Does passive reading create intellectual sheep, content to follow the herd, and accept whatever they are told? Are we in danger of creating a society of well-informed individuals who lack the ability to think critically and independently? But is Socrates' emphasis on active engagement still relevant in today's world, where we are constantly bombarded with information and competing for our attention? Does this attention economy make the problem worse? The sheer volume of information available to us can be overwhelming, making it difficult to focus and engage deeply with any one thing. Social media and other online platforms are designed to capture and hold our attention, often at the expense of thoughtful reflection and critical inquiry. If all of that's true, how can we make Socrates' lesson a relevant part of our lives? Now, let's shift perspective and consider that Socrates' rejection of writing was not absolute, but a call to recognize its limitations and use it as a tool rather than allowing it to master us. Is it possible to reclaim Socratic wisdom in the digital age by adopting a more mindful and discerning approach to written information? How can we harness the power of writing while avoiding its potential pitfalls? Perhaps writing can be beneficial as long as we recognize its risks. This brings us to the concept of mindful consumption, which involves engaging with written information in a more active, critical, and discerning way. Instead of passively absorbing whatever we read, we can learn to question assumptions, evaluate sources, and consider alternative perspectives. One specific step we can take is to actively seek out diverse sources of information, challenging ourselves to read opinions and perspectives that differ from our own. Another is to develop the habit of fact-checking and verifying information before accepting it as true. What are some other specific steps that we can take in our daily lives to address this? To that end, here are some specific resources to use. Consider utilizing media literacy organizations like the News Literacy Project or the Center for Media Literacy, which provide tools and resources for evaluating the credibility and reliability of information. Develop critical thinking skills by practicing techniques such as the Socratic method, which involves asking probing questions to uncover underlying assumptions and biases. Utilize source evaluation frameworks such as the CRAAP test, currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose, to assess the quality and trustworthiness of sources. If we do that, what happens to our ability to think critically? By recognizing the limitations of writing and prioritizing dialogue, critical thinking, and personal experience, we can reclaim the wisdom of Socrates and navigate the complexities of the modern world. What would Socrates think of the internet, with its endless stream of written information and opportunities for both dialogue and passive consumption? Perhaps he would caution us to use it wisely, to prioritize genuine understanding over mere information, and to cultivate our own active, critical, and engaged minds. Does that suggest that Socrates' message transcends the format, from live dialogue to video? As we prepare to conclude, let's remember that Socrates' insights remain remarkably relevant, even in our hyperconnected, digitally driven world. His emphasis on active engagement, critical thinking, and personal experience offers a powerful antidote to the passivity and superficiality that can often accompany our reliance on written information. His is a timeless message, relevant for everyone. As we reach the final stretch of our exploration into Socrates' reasoning and the perceived limitations of writing, does it not give you pause to reconsider your relationship with the written word and how you pursue knowledge? What lessons can we extract from Socrates' choice for our modern lives, saturated as they are by information and often starved of wisdom? In essence, We've argued that an uncritical acceptance of writing as the superior form of knowledge transmission carries inherent risks. The nuance of live discourse gets flattened, ideas become detached from the context of lived reality, and the act of learning risks becoming a passive exercise. But Socrates wasn't arguing for doing away with writing, so much as seeing that dialogue, critical thinking, and real-world experience remain essential components of genuine understanding. The point is not to reject the benefits of the written word, but to cultivate active, critical thinking skills alongside it. In this digital age, how can we embrace technology without succumbing to its potential pitfalls? Remember our earlier discussion of the sophists and how Socrates challenged their emphasis on rhetoric over genuine wisdom. This challenge resonates even more powerfully today, in our information-saturated world where persuasive messaging often trumps truth. Think back, too, to the historical examples we explored, the misinterpretations of written texts that led to conflict and dogma. How can we avoid similar pitfalls in our own time, as algorithms curate our news feeds and echo chambers reinforce our biases? The need for criticality transcends eras and cultures. Recall also the concerns about echo chambers and hyperconnectivity, and how Socrates might view the death of dialogue. Is the cacophony of opinions drowning out thoughtful engagement? And so, here is the ultimate insight. True understanding doesn't come from passively consuming written information, but from actively engaging with ideas through dialogue, critical thinking, and personal experience. Socrates' refusal to write was not a rejection of knowledge, but an affirmation of the importance of cultivating an active, engaged mind and soul. It wasn't about hoarding facts, but igniting the flame of critical inquiry within oneself. Wisdom, therefore, requires more than just information. It demands critical reflection, ethical action, and a commitment to continuous learning. The search itself is the reward, and as we have seen, demands internal reflection. The implications of Socrates' approach extend far beyond the individual. Consider the contemporary societal challenges we face: the spread of misinformation, the decline of critical thinking, and the polarization of public discourse. Socrates' emphasis on dialogue, critical questioning, and ethical action provides a powerful framework for navigating these challenges and building a more informed and engaged citizenry. But is this just relevant to individuals? Consider institutions, organizations, and even governments. If we implemented Socratic principles broadly, how would this change our society? Therefore, let us embrace our own capacity for critical thinking, ethical action, and the pursuit of wisdom. As we move forward, the journey toward understanding is ongoing, and questioning and self-reflection are essential components of personal growth. Remember, we are not merely passive recipients of information. We are active participants in the creation of knowledge. Thank you for your time and attention, and for your willingness to engage with complex ideas and challenge your assumptions. By embracing Socratic principles, we can create a more informed, engaged, and ethical world. Just think, we have come full circle, back to where we started. So, engage in meaningful dialogue and critical debate with others, both online and offline. Challenge yourself to seek out diverse perspectives and respectfully question your own assumptions. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments section and create a community of learners and thinkers. And finally, let us remember that Socrates' legacy is not a set of written doctrines, but a call to cultivate an active, critical, and engaged mind. The journey of discovery is endless. Thanks for looking.